actually you haven't forgotten everything. It's already inside your brain. It's just in a place that's so far in the deepness of your brain that you can't reach it right now. But with a little exercise, it's going to come right back. So yeah, by the way, I noticed I didn't get any Facebook friends yesterday. Okay, so this is the page, the LAStools page, and it's full of stories. Some are serious. This is a bit more funny here. Turning Esri into the Death Star of Star Wars. And so there's some humor with LiDAR returns. And so on. So a lot of interesting announcements are also made here. The more useful place for doing work is the rapidlasso.com webpage. And you can always download the latest version of LAStools right here where it says download. I mean, you don't need to do that right now because you actually do have the latest version of LAStools all in your laptop right now. And if you need help, the best place to go, apart from writing me an email, apart from coming to me during this week, which is by far the best way to go, is there's one menu item called support, and if you click here, or if you go on the user forum, that's the same link, you come to this group. It's a group on it's a group on Google Groups, and it has I think over 2,200 members or so, and almost every question that people have about LAStools has eventually been asked. So you can just go in here and say, you know, LastRound error. If there's some error with LastRound and you don't understand it. Now I can't search right now because I'm not online, but if I now search for this, it would list me all the questions many different people have asked and all my answers and also the answers of other users, because it's not only me now answering questions in this forum, it's also other users that are already very experienced in using LAStools. And another place to go is, occasionally I answer questions there too because people ask it here. It's the LinkedIn group of LAStools. There's also a number of stories about LiDAR and so on. Okay, back to work. Today I'll be using this little magnifier here to make it easier to see. I hope you still have all your LAStools directory somewhere. It hasn't disappeared overnight, you didn't delete it because you needed more space for pictures or videos. If you have, you know, you can always get a new copy. What I didn't mention yesterday, because some of you probably, they went back to the hotel and they didn't want to even have dinner, they just wanted to do more LAStools, right? Very likely. So, there are actually 4 PDFs in that folder, which are sort of detailed step-by-step instructions for common tasks with LAStools. And it's not exhaustive, and the first 3 we will basically be doing this morning. More or less like it is done here. So if you come home and you've forgotten it, you can basically look up exactly the steps we took, plus minus some minor variations. This one, the last one, tutorial 4, that's about how to manual edit LiDAR. I talked about it a little bit yesterday, we deleted a few points, but there were a few options to actually how to save the file and so on that I didn't mention, and that's described here. And also the PowerPoint I was using, that's right here. Okay, I think it's time for a little warm-up exercise with LAStools. Okay, so let's get Last warmed up. into the bin directory. There is a tool, I called it before the Swiss Army knife of LAStools. It's called LAStools. And if you double click it, you get again the beautiful window that you're already accustomed to. So LAStools is a tool that takes one LAS file as input, or LAS file, LAZ, and produces another LAS file or LAZ file as output. That is useful for, you know, I think Charm used it to cut out some data, right? Cut out some data for the exercises this afternoon. I think we're going to do all the exercises with the LiDAR data from the Philippines in the afternoon, and in the morning we're going to do the one I'm familiar with. Because this is going to be data I've never seen before except yesterday, a few minutes. It's always good to start with something where I know it's going to work, and then we'll go from there. So, what I want to do with this, I want to remember FUSA through the browse button, and by going up one directory, there was this data directory here. And in the data directory there was, if I double click, there was FUSA. If you double click that, you get again our famous aqua, whatever, cyan box. I just have a quick look at it just to remind you how the viewing goes. Simple, okay, it's a classified LiDAR data set. Now what I want to do at the warm-up exercise, I want to classify this one again. It's already classified. So how do I know I'm actually not cheating? Well, the first thing I will do, I will unclassify it. And that's a typical operation for last to last. So I will delete the classification. Now, that means like I'm turning it into raw LiDAR again, essentially. And if I go to the transform folder, transform rollout, which we haven't used this. So the difference between filters and transforms is a filter can do only one thing. It can remove points. It doesn't change them. It removes them. It removes in many different ways. It removes only it removes them by, for example, keeping only the first returns, or it removes them by keeping only the ground points. It can remove them by keeping every fifth point, and it can remove them by taking only the first point falling onto a grid. Or it can even randomly remove points. That's filtering, so it removes points. Transform changes points. So it changes something, it modifies a point somehow. And what we want to modify right now is we want to erase the classification. Erasing the classification is the same as setting the classification to 0. So I'm looking for the different transforms I have. Well, these are coordinate transforms. I don't want to transform the coordinates. So I'm looking in other items, and there's something called set classification 0. Set classification 0. Now, why do I show you this? Well, because last is the Swiss Army knife, and there are many other things you may want to do eventually, and they'll be similar, you know. For example, you may want to set the user data, you don't know what that is yet. Set the user data to 0 before you give your data out to somebody, because they don't know what your user data means. You want to set the point source ID. That's sometimes important, so you have flight line information. You can do all this with this tool. Or clamp intensity, that's sometimes useful. Some software cannot display intensities below 255. So it's sometimes useful to clamp the intensity at 255. And a few other things. So on the other side of the menu, I want to specify my output. And as the output, remember before we just used the appendix, and I'm going to set the appendix to, well, I'm making it raw LiDAR again, so I'm going to call it raw. And that's all I want to change about it. So I say, I press the run button. And now I can review my command line. And as I told you before, it is teaching you the command line. Yeah, press run after setting these things. And now, your path may be different because I installed LAStools on the H drive. I don't know where you installed it, so this can look different. But eventually there should be LAStools data fusa.lats. There should be the command set the classification to 0 and the output appendix _raw, and the output format is LAZ. If you don't have that minus underscore, if you remove this, you will get an LAS file. The only difference is it's much bigger. Sometimes it's useful to create an LAS file because not all software can read LAZ. Many softwares can, but not all. For example, the big, the big Death Star from the Facebook page, with the Esri colors, they cannot yet read LAZ because they're always a little slow. Death Stars are slow. They're deadly but slow. I like to make fun. So that looks good to me. So I just press start. Oh, it's already done. Yeah, that was a very small file. So for small files, it's like this. So what I basically did now, I created the raw LiDAR that we're going to use to classify now. And the first thing we do is when classifying the points into ground and non-ground, and then the other stuff, is which tool? Yeah, that's one of the tools you will be using over and over again. So, LastRound. I went into the bin directory and I looked for LastRound, and here's LastRound. I exited the other tool. It's good to exit tools sometimes, otherwise you have 20 windows open and then you don't know which window is which window anymore. So now I'm going to browse. And again, I go up one directory. I go into the data directory. And voila, there's a new FUSA. The one that we just created, the raw one. So I'm double clicking this. And let's have a look if we really remove the classifications. So we say view. So I'm just viewing this file. Yeah? And yeah, last view is actually it looks into the file. If it finds classifications, it shows you the classifications. If it doesn't find any classifications, it shows you a height coloring instead. Because otherwise it would just be black points and that'd be really boring. So you can check if I go now to color by classification. It's all black. I did that by right-clicking, color by classification. And then they become all black. So yes, I did correctly remove all the classifications. So I can start fresh. How does it look? Everybody should sort of have a black version of FUSA now on their screen. Has anybody not reached that step? Okay. So now we will ground classify. In this scene, if you remember, there were some pretty big buildings. I don't know how big they were. Are they? I think the option, and then sometimes you need to try a few options. So I'm going to try now the option city or warehouses. This is bigger buildings. There was at least one bigger building. If it's really big buildings like IKEAs, you know, or like malls, then you need to go to Metropolis to remove them. I will choose extra fine. And because in the next step, I want to classify them, I will also use compute height. And compute height will compute the height of every point and store it into the user data field. I mentioned this field before. User data is a field that every point has where you can sort of store whatever you want to. It's not part of the specification. It's you can do with it what you want to. LAStools uses it to store the height of the point above the ground points, but heavily quantized. Quantized means it's only an approximation. I store it in decimeters, so that's in increments of 10 centimeters, and I don't store negative ones. So it starts from 0 and goes to 255 decimeters. That means 0 meters to 25.5 meters. That's a very useful range. You can only store 255 different numbers in there because it's a small field with 8 bits. I don't know if you're familiar about the whole bits and numbers. One more thing I want to do, I want to give it an output name. So I call that now underscore ground. Run. So now let's look a bit at this command line. LastRound, as input, it takes the FUSA raw file. It uses the option city and extra fine, and it will also compute height. Now I should mention, compute height is only available in the licensed version. Otherwise, you need to run a separate program called LastHeight to compute the height in the next step. This is sort of a little bit, I give people an incentive to buy the licensed version. There are other things that happen if you don't have a licensed version. However, if you don't have a licensed version, you can still do all these kind of exercises and do kind of small-scale production work. When you're not supposed to do production work, small-scale, experimentation work. By the way, the license you have, and you should, is I think for 45 days. 45 days academic license. So when you go back, you still have a license. I don't know how long this whole licensing process is going to take for those of you who will get LAStools. And again, LAStools also works without a license, but it starts to add distortions to the output as soon as you go over a certain point limit. That's sort of, yeah, it's a trade-off. A lot of students use LAStools without a license, and they use some tricks to get around the distortions, and that's fine. For students, that's fine. For production work, that wouldn't be fine, because somehow I need to finance myself too. But yeah, I just wanted to point you out, this option only works in the licensed version in one step. Otherwise, you need to do 2 steps. Because if your license runs out, then after running LastRound, you run last height, and it has exactly the same effect in total, but you have to run 2 programs instead of 1. So minus ODIX, remember that will add _ground to the file name. But hey, our file name is already _raw, so there will be _raw, _ground. And next they're going to classify it, and it's going to be _classify. It's going to get longer and longer. Well, I teach you a little trick now. And you're all going to do a little command line for typing now. There's another command that's very similar to this one that can be used to cut off a few characters from the file name. And it's called, and you can type this anywhere. Maybe the safest place to type it is at the very end, so you make spaces. Minus, every command starts with minus. O cut. Minus O cut says, cut some characters from the end of the file name. And how many? You need to specify how many. Well, I want to cut _raw. So I want to cut 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't count the extension. So I say minus O cut 4. And now if everything goes well, I should get fooza minus the raw, and then the ground added. And that's a very nice, simple way to make sure, especially when your project grows, it's important to have good file names. Because you think, when you start, oh yeah, I know that data, but then 3 months later, you're, what did I 3 months ago, what did this name meant, And then everything has the same name. Consistent naming from the beginning, like, if you work on the, Agano data, and you make a bunch of tiles, don't call them just tile or something, just call them whatever, Agano, and then something. Because otherwise, you find something and you can just look at the file name and you will already know where it's from. If you don't have that, you actually have to open the file into a program and see where in the Philippines it is in order to know that, and that just slows you down. Okay, so I'm pressing start, and I hope I didn't mistype anything. Important is, there must have been a space between O cut and the 4. You can't write O cut 4. O cut space 4. So where did it not work? Who forgot the space? Or who made too many spaces? Well, let's see if it worked for you. If it worked for you, you should now have in the data folder, just like me, you should now have, here was our raw and here's our ground. Okay, next step, let's classify it. That's a new tool, classifying building and vegetation points. Last classified. Classified, here it is. That's right here. Finds buildings and trees, or vegetation in general. Well, it tries to find them. It's not perfect, and there's some conditions. It needs to be a certain density, and it needs to be ground classified, and it needs to have the heights. That's one requirement. It says in the README file very explicitly, it needs to have the height either with LastRound and the compute height option, or LastRound followed by last height. Otherwise, it cannot work because it needs that information for classification. So again, I'm browsing, but this time I'm loading the ground classified points. And I want to have a look at it first because I'm not sure I did it correctly. Maybe I need to change the options. So I have a quick look how the ground classification turned out. So I'm just viewing this file. Now I press G, I only get the ground points, and I say T to triangulate them, and I say minus to make them small, and beautiful ground. Looks like it worked okay. Now I say first, and I triangulate again, and then I have the DSM. DSM, ground, triangulate, DTM. So now I can quickly visually tell that it seems to have done a good job with removing all the man-made objects and all the vegetation and the wires and so on. Of course, because if my ground classification is bad, if I now then do a next classification, then that's going to be even worse because it assumes that the ground was correctly classified. So last classify, there's not a whole lot to do. I usually leave just the default settings when I run it the first time. The only important things to do, of course, is again setting the output options right. So this one I call classify. I call it underscore classify. And that's it. Everything else I just leave like it is. I say run. And I'm looking at my command line that's doesn't really have any new parameters. It uses the tool LastClassify. As input it uses the ground. And it hence the classify. And of course same game again. I don't want it to be ground and classified. I want to cut off the ground. So what do I do? So what should I type exactly?
Minus space 7.
Minus?
Space 3.
Okay.
Minus
Or 3 spaces, just to be sure. Minus O cut space 7. 7, you think 7? Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. I think they can do it. I see start. And that's a very small data set. I just, I didn't want to spend a lot of time in processing. We already spent a lot of time setting up the projector. But this should get you back into the mood of yesterday. So, exiting this program. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at it.